The knock came out louder than I intended. It echoed through the silent corridor like an accusation, sharp enough to make me wince at my own desperation. For a moment, I stood frozen outside my apartment door, staring at the useless brass handle as if it might somehow take pity on me and turn itself. My key was gone. Not misplaced in some obvious pocket or dropped in my car. Gone. Vanished somewhere between locking my flat after work and returning home just after midnight with nothing but my phone and the stale remains of a petrol station sandwich. I knocked again, softer this time, then rubbed my forehead. There was only one person awake in this building at odd hours. Everyone knew it. The light beneath number 12 always burned late into the night, long after the rest of us had gone to bed. My divorced neighbor, Eleanor Whitmore. She'd lived across the hall for nearly 3 years, and in all that time, we'd spoken perhaps a dozen times. She was polite but reserved, always carrying herself with a kind of quiet dignity that discouraged casual conversation. She looked to be in her late 40s, with chestnut hair usually pinned up carelessly and a thoughtful face that seemed permanently caught between sadness and patience. People in the building whispered about her divorce when she first moved in. They whispered because people often preferred stories over understanding. I'd heard fragments: a husband who'd left after 20 years, grown children living overseas, a legal battle that had taken everything except her pride. But if Eleanor carried any bitterness, she never showed it. She simply smiled politely, watered the potted fern outside her door, and lived her life as though silence itself were company enough. I hesitated before knocking on her door. It felt intrusive, like stepping into sacred ground. Still, I had nowhere else to go. After a moment, footsteps approached from inside. The door opened just enough for Eleanor's face to appear. Her expression shifted from caution to surprise. "Daniel?" I gave an embarrassed half-laugh. "Sorry. I know it's late." She blinked once, then opened the door wider. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a navy dress and reading glasses low on her nose. A book rested in one hand, finger marking her place. "What's happened?" "I've locked myself out." The words sounded childish the moment they left my mouth. For half a second, she stared at me. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Oh, thank goodness." I frowned. "Thank goodness?" Her smile widened slightly. For a dreadful moment, I thought something terrible had happened. I let out a breathless chuckle. "No. Just me being an idiot." "Well," she said, stepping aside, "that's considerably easier to solve. Come in." "Oh, no, I couldn't." "You certainly can. It's midnight, Daniel. Unless you plan to sleep in the hallway." I hesitated only a second before stepping inside. Her flat smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. It was warmer than mine ever felt, filled with soft yellow lamplight and shelves stacked high with novels, framed photographs, and small ceramic ornaments. A knitted throw was draped neatly across the sofa. Classical music played quietly from somewhere deeper inside. It felt less like an apartment and more like a place where time had agreed to slow down. "Sit," Eleanor said. "I'll make tea." "That's really not necessary." She gave me a look over the rim of her glasses. "I'm British by ancestry and temperament. Tea is always necessary." I laughed and obeyed. As she disappeared into the kitchen, I sank onto the sofa and glanced around. The room held traces of a full life, pictures of 2 young adults laughing on a beach, travel postcards pinned near the bookshelf, a framed sketch of what looked like the London skyline. It struck me then how little I knew about the woman living 20 feet from me. Eleanor returned carrying 2 mugs and set one before me. "There. Crisis management." "Thank you." She settled into the armchair opposite. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked, "Long day?" I looked down into my tea. "Something like that." She didn't press. That, somehow, made me answer. "I was laid off this morning." The confession surprised even me. Her expression softened, but she said nothing. The silence invited honesty. The company's downsizing. Apparently my department was non-essential restructuring overlap, whatever that means. I gave a hollow laugh. 12 years, and that's what I got. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. That must have hurt. Simple words. No forced optimism. No hollow advice. Just truth. I nodded. It did. The room grew still. Then she said quietly, "Would you like to know the strangest thing about losing something important?" I glanced up. What? She leaned back slightly, her eyes thoughtful. You eventually realized the loss wasn't the thing that broke you. I frowned. What was? The moment you decided it defined you. I stared at her. She smiled faintly. When my marriage ended, I thought my life had ended with it. 22 years gone. Plans gone. The person I believed myself to be, gone. Her voice held no bitterness. Only memory. For nearly a year, I sat exactly where you are, convinced I'd become a footnote in my own life. What changed? Eleanor looked toward the window, where city lights glimmered beyond the glass. One morning, I realized the sun had risen without asking whether I felt ready. I smiled despite myself. That's oddly poetic. I was an English teacher for 20 years. Occupational hazard. That startled me. You taught? Literature. Why'd you stop? Her expression shifted, something shadowed crossing it. Life became complicated. I moved here after the divorce and never went back. I nodded, sensing the edges of a story too personal to touch. Instead, I said, I used to write. Her eyebrows lifted. Used to? I shrugged. Nothing serious. Short stories mostly. Years ago. And why did you stop? The answer came too quickly. Work. She tilted her head. No. Work is what you did instead. Why did you stop? The question landed harder than I expected. I stared into my tea. Because I'd convinced myself writing was childish. Impractical. Something to outgrow. Because my father had once read one of my stories and said kindly, almost absent-mindedly, "Nice hobby, son. But make sure you have a real plan." Because I'd spent 15 years proving I could be practical enough to deserve respect. And somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten what made me feel alive. I don't know, I said finally. Eleanor smiled gently. That usually means you do know. We talked until nearly 2 in the morning. Not dramatic conversations. Just fragments of ourselves exchanged like carefully wrapped gifts. She told me about teaching Shakespeare to bored 16-year-olds and pretending not to notice when they rolled their eyes. About her daughter in Melbourne and her son in Edinburgh. About learning, painfully, that being left did not mean being unworthy. I told her about my failed engagement 5 years earlier, about burying myself in work afterward because spreadsheets were easier than heartbreak, about the unfinished manuscript hidden in a drawer I hadn't opened in 8 years. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt something inside me unclench. Eventually, Eleanor glanced at the clock. You can take the sofa. Oh no, I couldn't. You can and you will. I won't have you haunting the hallway like some regretful Victorian ghost. I laughed. And because I was too exhausted to argue, I accepted. The next morning, I woke to sunlight and the smell of toast. For one blissful second, I forgot where I was. Then memory returned. I sat up to find a folded note on the coffee table. Daniel. Emergency locksmith arrives at 10. You looked as though sleep had become a stranger, so I let you keep company with it. Breakfast in kitchen. No arguments. Eleanor. I smiled. In the kitchen, she stood at the stove humming softly. Good morning, she said without turning. You really do command people with breakfast notes? Only deserving cases. I laughed and sat. The locksmith came and opened my flat before noon. I thanked Eleanor awkwardly, promising to repay her somehow. she waved it off. Just return the mug eventually. But something had shifted. After that night, we began talking. At first, casually in the corridor. Then over tea every few evenings. Weeks passed. Job interviews came and went with polite rejections. My savings shrank. Anxiety returned in waves. One evening, Eleanor appeared at my door holding a thick notebook. "This was in storage," she said. I took it. Blank pages. "What's this?" "A solution." I looked up. She met my gaze steadily. "You're unemployed, discouraged, and spectacularly miserable. It seems the perfect time to start writing again." I nearly laughed. "Eleanor. No excuses. You once loved it. That's enough reason." I stared at the notebook. The pages seemed impossibly white. Terrifyingly hopeful. That night, I wrote one sentence. The next day, 3 more. Then a page. Then 5. Words returned awkwardly at first, like old friends unsure of their welcome. But they returned. Weeks became months. I found part-time work at a local bookshop to cover expenses. It paid less than my corporate salary but left my evenings free. And I wrote. Eleanor became my first reader. She circled awkward phrasing with ruthless precision and praised good lines with equal honesty. "Don't flatter yourself," she'd say, handing back pages marked in red. "I'm investing in future bragging rights." For the first time in my adult life, I felt aligned with myself. Then, one autumn evening, Eleanor didn't answer her door. At first, I thought she'd gone out. But the next morning, still no answer. Worry prickled. By afternoon, building management opened her flat. They found her collapsed in the kitchen. A minor stroke, the doctors said later. Caught in time. She would recover. But recovery would be slow. I visited the hospital every day. At first she slept. Then, gradually, she woke. When she saw me sitting beside her bed on the 3rd day, she frowned. "You look dreadful." I laughed shakily. "You had a stroke." "Yes, well. Very inconsiderate timing." Relief hit so hard it nearly dropped me to my knees. Her recovery took months. During physiotherapy, I read my manuscript aloud to her. She critiqued from her wheelchair with terrifying efficiency. "This chapter drags. You're impossible." "You're welcome." And somehow, through that season of healing, our friendship deepened into something steadier than either of us expected. Not romance. Something rarer. Chosen family. The kind built deliberately, through kindness repeated until trust becomes home. A year after the night I lost my key, my manuscript sold. Not for a fortune. Not enough to transform my life overnight. But enough. Enough to matter. The publisher called on a Thursday afternoon. I stood frozen in my kitchen, listening as the editor praised the story and offered terms I could barely process. When the call ended, I crossed the hall and knocked. Eleanor opened the door, cane in hand now but standing straighter every week. "Well?" she asked. I held up the contract with trembling fingers. Her eyes widened. Then she smiled, a radiant, triumphant smile that made her look 20 years younger. "Oh," she whispered. And before I could speak, she pulled me into a fierce embrace. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she murmured against my shoulder, "I knew it." I laughed through tears. "How?" "Because," she said, stepping back, eyes shining, "sometimes people only need one locked door to discover the life waiting on the other side." A year later, my first novel sat in bookshop windows across the country. The dedication page contained only 7 words. For Eleanor, who opened the right door. At the launch event, she sat in the front row, elegant in navy blue, applauding louder than anyone. When my speech ended, I looked directly at her and said, "The best things in life rarely arrive as planned. Sometimes they begin with loss. Sometimes with failure. Sometimes with standing helpless in a hallway at midnight, certain you've locked yourself out of everything that matters. The audience laughed softly. But if you're fortunate, someone opens a door. And if you're wise enough to walk through it, you may discover you were never locked out at all. You were only being led home. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. So did mine. And standing there, under warm lights with my book in my hands and the truest friend I'd ever known smiling back at me, I understood something simple and extraordinary. Life does not end when plans collapse. Sometimes that is precisely when it begins. And often, hope arrives quietly, wearing reading glasses, holding tea, and opening the door at midnight.